But there are a couple of changes in the areas of value-added tax and excise duty and extractive industry. Let's start with the extractive industry, operations related to oil, gas and mining. The bill seeks to introduce a 10% duty on operations related to oil, gas and mining. Are you concerned with this, considering, one, our capacity to extract oil by ourselves and the balance between taxing and raising revenue so we don't chase away foreign investors? Your take on this?
We always use tax incentives in two ways, either to discourage something or to encourage something. If we don't want people to smoke, we can raise the taxes on cigarettes so that it becomes very costly for people to buy cigarettes or to smoke. If we want, that's just an example. If we want to encourage people to do something, we can reduce the taxes. So if we want to increase exploration in oil and gas, the most logical thing is to reduce the taxes. But by bringing in a new duty, the government might actually be telling us indirectly that there will be a lot of activities in this area. Because even if an industry or a sector is doing very well, the government is always attracted to come and get tax from it. A good example is digital tax. A lot of businesses have been taking place online or on digital platforms. The government brought the digital tax. So bringing 10% duty on oil and gas might be an indicator that this sector is vibrant. What we do not know is how the investors are going to react to that. My guess is they will lobby for it to be lowered so that they can bring more investment.
See how it all plays out. Still, with some of the changes in the area of value-added tax, the 16% VAT is set to be imposed, and the move will see food prices significantly go up. The price of bread, of course, this has hit the headlines, is set to go up by roughly 8 shillings. We have infant powdered milk, which is also targeted. Well, what say you, from Wanjiku's point of view, who are listening to some of this tax measures being put in place and the cost of food going up? What would you say to our viewers right now?
If you are the government, the most logical thing, if you want more revenues, is to tax products and services that we must use. For example, we shall always eat. If you have a kid, you borrow, you buy diapers. If you have a kid, you borrow infant formulas. So if I can try and talk like an economist, you normally try and tax products and services that have low elasticity of demand. So even if the price goes up, people still buy them. So that is probably what the government is targeting by taxing such products. But on the other hand, you make people suffer because these are essentials. This is what they must take. So I think as we come up with new tax measures, we must be considerate of the people on the lower echelons of the society, people who live from hand to mouth, people who don't have a constant salary, people who are not assured of their daily bread. So we must have a balance between that. So my suggestion is, as we come up with the new tax measures, I know the government is looking for revenues, but I think we should be considerate of the less fortunate members of the society, particularly those who are in the informal sector.
Okay, especially being considerate on essential commodities is quite important. But still on being considerate, talk to me about this proposal which will subject loans to a processing fee of 20% excise duty. I'm sure it's not all smiles for the borrower, because it might trickle all the way down to the borrower in terms of the cost of getting a loan. Well, what say you about this?
If my memory serves right, I thought that processing fee was being removed so that it becomes much easier, it becomes cheaper for the banks to process your loans. And the thinking has been that if it is cheaper to process your own, then people are going to borrow more money. If they borrow more money, they're going to spend it. And if they spend it, that is going to stimulate the economy. So I think, in my opinion, it's a good economic decision if you can reduce the cost of processing loans.
Okay, yet another proposal. The bill amends the VAT Act in one way or the other to prevent groups of companies from benefiting from the group registration for the tax. Is it a backward step considering the cost of doing business as well as cost savings in companies?
You know, there's always this game in economics where the government comes to the regulation, and then people come up with the ways of going that regulation. The regulation is always evolving. So you come up with the regulation, people come up with something else to go around that regulation. So I think the government might have discovered a loophole in group regulation where they are not able to collect some tax. So probably that's why they're making that change. But I think any tax measure should always be instituted with the intention of making the business environment more friendly, more vibrant, so that in the long run we may not correct more taxes today, but we can correct more taxes in future. So current interest, the future interest, personal interest and group interest. And probably you might have noted that most of us are working in groups, chamas, companies, and so on. Maybe that's why the government is moving in that direction.
Okay, it's interesting. Still on being considerate, well, what's your take on motorcycles, boda bodas? We well know of the role they play in our society. The motorcycles or owners will have to pay an excise duty of 15%, which is definitely likely to push up the cost of owning a boda boda up. This might actually see issues to do with those who own boda bodas. What's your take on this briefly?
Let me take you back to my previous argument about the price elasticity of demand. The government knows very well that we have become addicted to boda bodas. You go to the countryside, you go to the urban areas, they are boda bodas. So they know that we cannot win ourselves out of boda bodas. So even if you bring a new tax, I don't think that is going to stop men and women from buying boda bodas or motorcycles. That's why they bring that tax, because they know at the end of the day, they are going to correct some taxes. So it might appear punitive, but that's a growth industry. And if you and me are making money from boda bodas, why can't the government also make some money from there? So it might appear punitive to the people who operate boda bodas, but it is very sweet music to the government because they'll correct more taxes, and they know that we not avoid taking a boda boda because of that. The same with the people who smoke cigarettes, that who take alcohol and other essential things that are addictive or we think are essentials. As even if they are taxed, we still consume them. We don't stop consuming them because of pricey taxes. So from an economic perspective, that's a good measure. But if you look at it from a humanitarian perspective, it's not a good measure because the people at the lower echelons of the society who use boda bodas might feel the effect.
Okay, so let's still take a look at the economic and humanitarian aspect of this other move, where businesses will actually have to pay 1% minimum tax on their gross turnover. What say you about this from an economic and humanitarian point of view?
I think now you have started talking my language, economic and humanitarian point of view. I found that quite interesting because in the way we teach business, the way we teach economics is that you are taxed on your profit. But the government is saying, if that law is instituted, that you pay 1% tax on your turnover, whether you make profit or not. From where I sit, I see that as a very ingenious way of the government to make sure that you pay taxes. Remember, at the end of the day, when you are filing your taxes, that can be offset depending on whether you make profit or not. Now, for the biggest problem with this method of taxing 1% of turnover is it is going to penalize the startups. I'm starting a business, I don't have any money, I don't have any revenues, but I'm still being taxed. So in the long run, I see this as discouraging new investment. I see the biggest loser in this as startups, new businesses, SMEs, and small investors. So I don't think this would be a good move. But if the government wants to correct more revenues, then the best thing to do is to tax profits, make the environment so friendly that we make more profit and the government gets a share of that, the 30% or so, instead of taxing businesses before they have made any money.
Okay, so those with the argument that we might be robbing Peter to pay Paul are actually right, according to you.
They might be right, but you also have to remember that the government is trying to seek, not to seek, but to close tax loopholes. Because they're saying if you always keep on reporting losses at the end of the year when you're fighting taxes, then the government will never get tax from you. So why don't I get that tax from the beginning, so that at the end of the day, whether you make money or not, I've got my due. I don't want to appear derogatory, but I remember one time going to a church where the first thing you do when you get to church is unalipa sadaka, you pay your tithe. So even if you get tired and go away, you have already paid your tithe. Maybe that is the procedure the government is using.
Interesting. Let's continue. I mean, issues to do with debt servicing definitely feature prominently when we're talking about the economy and issues to do with finances. We're in a scenario where 50 to 60% of our collection is actually going to service debt. Expenditure is barely going down despite commitment by the government to impose austerity measures. I mean, when the economy is not at full potential, what's your take on the borrowing composition we have right now? Less concessional, more commercial borrowing in foreign currency. Is this the right way to go?
I'm putting myself in the shoes of the government, that any money that I'm paid at the end of the month as a salary, or any money I made from the side hustles, I'm using 50% of it to pay debt. I don't think that is very healthy. So that is very costly. And remember, some of our debt is in foreign denomination. So it is not just affected by the amount of revenue that we collect, but also by the exchange rate. So I have already suggested that we should not get all our revenue from borrowing. We should properly diversify our sources of revenue. And that's, I guess, the reason why the government is really targeting on tax reform, so that we get more money from tax and we get less money from debt. But my biggest problem now is you need money to bridge the gap, the budget deficit. And the tax revenues are not enough. So the most logical thing to do is to borrow. But my suggestion has always been, and the previous speakers alluded to that, why can't we reduce our costs? Why can't we tighten our belts? The problem is that it is very hard to tighten the belt in the government for a very simple reason. A lot of tax revenues goes not just to paying taxes, but paying salaries. And it will be very difficult for the county governments, for the national government to start laying people off. It will have serious political backlash. So we need to balance between borrowing and getting tax revenues. Because I don't think keeping on borrowing money is very good for the country. We need to start living within our means and probably making sure that the tax revenues are not punitive, but they end up giving the government more revenues.
Okay, spot on. Concerns with infrastructure spending. Of course, we have multiple developments ongoing right now. Case in point, the JKIA Westlands Freeway just outside our offices here. But are we truly getting value for money as Wanjiku? Is there a proper trickle-down effect even during the construction and perhaps after, once they're completed? Are we looking at proper benefits due to this infrastructural developments that are quite ambitious in one way or the other? What's your take on this?
That's a very important question, because if you come to Nairobi, or you go to New York, or you go to any other big city, the first thing you notice is not the soft part of that city, but the physical part of that city, the infrastructure, the highways, the skyscrapers, and so on. But I want to imagine that before the government came up with the freeways, the JKAs and SGRs, they had done some cost-benefit analysis, and they can quantify the benefits to the society. What I suspect is most of the benefits we are going to get from this infrastructure development or investments might be long-term. But I'm of the opinion that the best way to do it is to balance infrastructure development, the physical infrastructure development, with the soft infrastructure. I'm talking about improving schools, improving hospitals, improving the working environment. Because the people in the rural areas might not use the freeway. The people in the rural areas might not use the SGR. But if we can now interconnect SGR, we can connect the freeway to the rural areas so that anybody doing business find it much cheaper now to transport goods and services from Mombasa to Shamahoho, the Karakara, or to any small village. If that happens, so that the infrastructure is not just about the urban people moving, so that it's not just about me finding it easier to go for a cup of tea from Westlands to Karen or the other way around. Our infrastructure should be about improving the productive capacity of the economy. If that is what we are going to get from the improvements, I am for it. If not, I'm not for it.
Okay, spot on. Well noted. Let's talk about our spending package as we go into the next financial year. 26.6 billion on post-COVID-19 recovery economic stimulus program. The executive has an allocation of 1.8 trillion, Parliament 37 billion, Judiciary 17 billion, and of course the counties sharing 370 billion. What's your take on the priority areas we have encompassed in this next financial year? Of course, 135.5 billion going to the Big Four agenda. What say you about this?
It's interesting how you have broke down the expenditure for next year between the Parliament, the Judiciary, and the Executive. And that data you have given probably shows you why the presidential position is very much fought for. Because one way to find out how much power you have is how much money you control. And you can clearly see that the executive still has a lot of power going by the amount of money the person is controlling. Now, if you look at now, the other thing is the sharing of the money between the national government and the county government. The national government has more money compared with the national government. The national government takes more money compared with the county government. So what I can say from this breakdown that we have given is that is what is probably driving the constitution, or the amendments in the constitution. People are feeling that the national government is getting so much money. Maybe if we get some of that money and devolve it to the grassroots, devolve it to the county, it might have a bigger economic impact. And if you also look at the way we are coming up with more constituencies and think about the CDF, it's probably about the same thing. But my argument should be, whether you're in the executive, in the county government, the judiciary, in the parliament, at the end of the day, whatever decisions we make about sharing the money should be about benefiting the lowest person in this society, the people or the lower echelons of the society. If we can do that, I'll be very happy. But at the end of the day, it's not about how we share this money, but how the ordinary person benefits. After all, it's not the executive's money, it's not the parliament's money, it's not the judiciary's money, it is the taxpayers' money. So it should be used as efficiently as possible.
Well, efficiency is definitely a goal. But speaking of efficiency, I beg to ask the question, might we be spending too much in one way or the other, in wages, in development, etc.? And are we wasting too much when it comes to corruption? Should we put necessary measures to actually stop the wastage within government, even as we check on the spending? What's your take on this?
That has been one of the suggested alternatives to reduce our budget deficit. We reduce the cost. And one of the costs that we complain about all the time is the cost of corruption. But there's another cost that we rarely talk about, the duplication of services. Are there some services that are duplicated by the national government and the county government? Are there some services that are duplicated by one ministry and the other ministry? And if we can reduce such wastes, then this budget that we're talking about would be almost sufficient for us. In fact, I look forward to the day our government is going to declare a budget surplus so that we have more revenue than the cost. And that is possible. If you look at what we argued earlier about the infrastructure, about the investments in all these services, if they can be put into use, we improve the efficiency of the economy, then that is possible.
Noted. Let me take you back a little bit to the finance bill, specifically the digital service tax, which in one way or the other did cause a stir online. Earlier on, the details were sort of ambiguous, but right now we have clarified details in terms of who it will apply to non-residents, as well as those businesses that are carried out over the internet or an electronic network. Talk to us about this. Might you have any concerns whatsoever in terms of the implementation of the digital service tax with the changes made so far?
It is interesting how late the digital tax came. If you look at the internet has been there for the last 20 years. I think I got my first email address around 1997, and that does not say anything about my age. So the digital space has been there for about 20 years or more. But it's only now that we are talking about digital tax. So one of the reasons why there has been a lot of innovation in that space is because there has been no tax. We argued earlier that one way to encourage a business to blossom is to give it tax incentives. So I'm concerned that once we start taxing the digital platforms, the digital businesses, then we are going to reduce the dynamism of that particular sector. So it must be balanced. For example, if you go online, you sell some of your services or some of your products, you probably make more money than if you do it face to face, because you may not need any inventories. That's what Alibaba, that is what Dell Computers did to go to the digital space, where you don't, for example, have inventories. So if you order some food from, let's say, a restaurant, they only cook it because you have ordered it. So you don't need to have shelves. If I'm selling computers, I can assemble computers only when they are ordered. I don't need to have spare parts put together. So my concern is that this digital tax might reduce the competitiveness and the innovation that has been there in digital space. I'm also concerned about the outsiders, the non-residents. You tell, let's say, Google and others to start paying taxes. They may start revenging against the services that probably they offer you. And I see a lot of talks. I remember I saw that in Europe, where I think it was France, they said they are going to start charging Google for doing some businesses in France online. And then the US government also retaliated and said, we are going to do this and this. So I think it's a very gray area. But my biggest worry is if digital tax discourages innovation, which is the blood of the digital space.
Okay, and especially since we're moving to the digital era, let's see how this rolls out. On changes to the VAT Act, there are others that have been amended, removed from the items of exempt or zero-rated status. Others have been reintroduced as exempt. Talk of medical supplies among them. Bearing in mind we're going through a pandemic, was this a good move, and perhaps generally factoring clean energy as well? What do you make of the changes to the VAT Act on the issues or items on exempt and zero-rated status?
Let's also remember that perhaps one reason why the government is targeting digital tax, I forgot to share with you, is after COVID-19, a lot of services are going digital. A lot of people are working at home. So that naturally means there will be a lot of money around that space, and the government is interested in that. Now, on tax exemption and zero rating, I support the idea of VAT exemption for medical services. Remember, we're in a pandemic. A lot of services that we're going to get cured from COVID or to prevent ourselves from being overwhelmed by COVID, these are a lot of services. We need PPEs, we need the syringes, we need the vials, we need a lot of grass for making those small things that where the vaccine is put. So I think one of the ways to deal with COVID pandemic would be to make it easier to acquire all the gadgets or the tools that can be used in curing or even in vaccination. So I think that was a good move. The other move that I found quite fascinating is reducing the VAT on geothermal. Everybody is talking about climatic change. And one way to reduce the effects of global warming would be to make it easier to use renewable energy. And I think the government is trying to encourage us to use renewable energy by reducing VAT on geothermal energy production and also solar production. which I found quite fascinating because if you remember last time there was a war between APLC and the solar power providers. So I think for the health of our planet, that's a good move. For the health of individuals, zero rating or reducing VAT on COVID-related products is a good move.
Well noted, Exen Iraqi. Many thanks for your time. Let's see how it all plays out, because the year ahead is definitely set to be challenging economic-wise due to the COVID-19 pandemic, lack of vaccines thereof. We wait and see, or the debate is out there, whether the finance bill and the expenditure budgets will do enough to address these challenges. Exen Iraqi giving us his input on some of the finance bill and the budget statements going forth into the next financial year. We appreciate your input. Allow us to take a short break. When we come back, the latest in international news. Stay with us.
This is KTN News.
Sauce Mosmos, the sauce that runs a lot slower.
Recipes with Zesta tomato sauce. In a large saucepan, melt butter and finely chopped onions, garlic and tomato paste and cook for about 5 minutes. Add Zesta tomato sauce and veggie stock and bring to boil. Fry your fish fillets until golden and well cooked through. Add the fish to the tomato sauce, turning the fish a couple of times to coat. Sprinkle with fresh parsley and serve warm.
COVID ilikam na ikashut down vitu mob, lakini bado kuna patients wengi wana need blood transfusion kama wase wako na hemophilia, yani wanakunid. Bila wewe, risk ni kubwa zaidi. Cheza kama wewe, donate blood leo. Download app ya Damu sasa kwa Google Play Store upate more info please unaweza donate na other benefits. Kumbuka kuvaa mask ukidonate blood.
Wakenya wamekuwa naulizia Baba Zero yuko wapi?
Mimi niko hapa.
I'm taking my time to enjoy the finer things in life.
Na Zizi alienda wapi?
Mimi nimekuwa nafanya muziki kwa miaka 21 sasa hivi.
Kuimba ni kazi yangu, ni kipaji changu. Nimewaachia watu siasa, siingilii.
Mimi niliingia bunge tukiwa tunapata mshahara ya shilingi 10,000.
Kalembe ajui kizungu, labda napewa Tanzania ambassador.
Ni kurapie kidogo ama ni sirabu?
Rap kabisa.
With Panadol's Optizorb formula, the tablet gently breaks down in the stomach, quickly absorbs, and starts providing pain relief in 15 minutes. For fast and effective pain relief that you can trust, try Panadol Advance. This has been Medifax for Panadol.
Business Today is a hub for small businesses. We tell the stories of success, of failure, and the lessons that we have learned from small businesses in Kenya.
Experts discuss and analyze the latest business and finance news from across the country and the world.
Because we know these matters are important to you, we take a deep dive to go to the movers and the shakers of the market to bring you matters that matter to you in a way that matters to you.
On Business Today, we not only tell you about what's happening on the local scene, we also take you to the international stage and help you connect the dots and understand what this means back home.
This is KTN News.
Welcome back. You're watching Morning Express. Let's get you updated on news making headlines across borders. And the WHO says that the coronavirus variant first identified in India last year was being classified as a variant of global concern, with some preliminary studies showing that it spreads more easily. The B1617 variant is the fourth variant to be designated as being of global concern and requiring heightened tracking and analysis. The others are those first detected in Britain, South Africa, and Brazil.
Globally, we're now seeing a plateau in the number of COVID-19 cases and deaths, with declines in most regions, including the Americas and Europe, the two worst affected regions. But it is an unacceptably high plateau, with more than 5.4 million reported cases and almost 90,000 deaths last week. We're still in a perilous situation. The spread of variants, increased social mixing, the relaxation of public health and social measures, and inequitable vaccination are all driving transmission. Yes, vaccines are reducing severe disease and deaths in countries that are fortunate enough to have them in sufficient quantities. And early results suggest that vaccines might also drive down transmission. The shocking global disparity in access to vaccines remains one of the biggest risks to ending the pandemic. High and upper middle income countries represent 53% of the world's population, but have received 83% of the world's vaccines. By contrast, low and lower middle income countries account for 47% of the world's population, but have received just 17% of the world's vaccines.
Right, and in similar news, world leaders welcomed the Biden administration's announcement for their support waiving patent restrictions on COVID-19 vaccines, the so-called TRIPS waiver at the World Trade Organization. While this could be a breakthrough in the global fight against the pandemic, let's see what our White House correspondent has to say.
With cases surging around the world, the U.S. decision to support waiving patents for COVID-19 vaccines is welcomed by more than 100 countries at the World Trade Organization, who also backed the so-called TRIPS waiver. The proposal was submitted in October 2020 by India and South Africa.
It goes to show the influence we have as a country, working together with others, that our voice and messages have weight.
The Biden administration is essentially committing to apply its convening power at the WTO to begin text-based negotiations to hammer out a compromise with countries that oppose the waiver, including the European Union, Japan, and the United Kingdom.
Sending a message multilaterally that the United States is back and the United States cares, not just about its own domestic interests, but also internationally on the multilateral stage, and is ready to play a leadership role, that's a very important signal.
But what the U.S. is supporting is narrower than the original proposal, covering only patents, not other intellectual property protections, and only vaccines, not other COVID-19 related technologies, including diagnostics and therapeutics.
We don't know what is going to happen in the actual process of formulating this text, and the extent to which the Biden administration is going to be willing to generate a compromise based on the push and pull, both at the international level, other member states, and internally, right? Internally, you have large pharmaceutical companies that are very concerned about the waiver.
It's the first step in a long process. The WTO is consensus-based, and all members must agree to move forward. Some waiver opponents, including the EU, have signaled they are open to negotiations to address the pandemic.
And that's why we are ready to discuss how the U.S. proposal for waiver on intellectual property protection for COVID vaccines could help achieve that objective.
Once WTO members agree on a text, a process that could take months, countries will implement laws to remove the legal risks of producing generic versions of the vaccines. The hope is that it will speed up global vaccinations and reduce inequity in distribution. While some countries like the US have given most of their population at least one shot, some countries have not even delivered a single shot. But the pharmaceutical industry warns that waiving patents may backfire.
You could have a sort of dangerous free-for-all where scarce supplies that are desperately needed to keep that manufacturing going end up being diverted potentially to companies that don't know what they're doing, and that will do more harm than good.
They say it's better to vaccinate the world through licensing agreements, such as the one between AstraZeneca and the Serum Institute of India. Humanitarian organizations demand these agreements meet certain standards.
It has to be transparent. It has to be worldwide available. It has to be accountable.
While the WTO deliberates on these complex intellectual property negotiations, COVID-19 surges like the one happening in India are a reminder of the urgency of vaccinating on a global scale. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News.
And closer to home, Sudan is facing an acute shortage of medical oxygen as a third wave of the coronavirus tears through their population. Let's see what this story is all about.
In Sudan's capital, Khartoum, oxygen cylinders are being loaded into the back of a car. They are on their way to a coronavirus patient's home for private use. But most of those seriously ill with COVID-19 are facing an acute shortage of medical oxygen. That's partly due to power cuts that impeded production at the economically struggling country's main plant. Hussein Malassi, a senior manager at the Sudanese liquid gas company, says a lack of cylinders is another problem.
Before the severity of this pandemic, the distribution of cylinders over the hospitals was sufficient. What happened is that the consumption of oxygen increased several times with the pandemic. And the cylinders at hospitals did not increase with the same level.
The government survey found that 38% of oxygen cylinders have been smuggled out of the health system for private use. Some patients bribed hospital staff, others relied on personal relationships. Everyone else has been left in hospitals unable to provide adequate care during a third wave of infections. Montasir Othman, Director of Emergency and Epidemic Control at Sudan's Ministry of Health, said times of peak infections make clear the weak capacity of Sudan's hospitals. He added that the government is working to make more cylinders available. But it's not just oxygen. The country, which has recorded 33,000 cases and 2,600 deaths since the start of the pandemic, has just 300 ventilators. Out of 37 hospitals that can take COVID-19 patients, only 11 are in the capital, which has 70% of cases. Last month, officials said Sudan could meet just 40% of its need for medicines. Social media is awash with desperate pleas for help, as relatives seek oxygen cylinders, beds and drugs for their loved ones.
Now, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa on Monday warned of vaccine apartheid if wealthier nations hog vaccines while poorer ones go without. Sisifo Sikweyiya has more.
South Africa's president has warned against wealthy nations hogging COVID-19 shots while millions in poor countries die in the queue waiting for them. That, Cyril Ramaphosa said, would be tantamount to, quote, vaccine apartheid. Sub-Saharan Africa has administered the fewest vaccines relative to its population than any other region. 8 doses per 1,000 people compared to 150 per 1,000 globally, according to the World Health Organization. South Africa and India have been pushing for a waiver on some intellectual property rights for vaccines, so they can be manufactured domestically.
Excellency President.
US President Joe Biden backed the proposal last week, though it could take months to reach a deal.
South Africa's nationality.
In a newsletter, Ramaphosa called on South Africans to support the waiver, saying vaccines should be a global public good. It is about affirming our commitment to the advancement of equality and human rights, not just in our own country, but around the world, he wrote. Ramaphosa said South Africa was one of only 5 countries on the African continent able to manufacture vaccines, and that there was a need for new capacity to be built.
Now, with the COVID-19 pandemic forcing quarantines and lockdowns globally, the world's homeless face a unique set of risks of exposure. In Russia, a forbidding climate means life on the streets is tougher than in most places, forcing the homeless to adapt to the times and Russian bureaucracy. Take a look.
Throughout the peak of the pandemic, Russia joined the ranks of governments ordering its people to quarantine at home for months on end. But it was never an option available to all. Noshlezhka, or Night Shelter, is Russia's oldest charity, providing aid to St. Petersburg's homeless population, estimated at some 15,000 by authorities and more than 3 times that amount by charity organizations.
Right away, we understood that people who live on the street will have nowhere to isolate. And let's say they have a positive COVID test or symptoms, they'll have nowhere to go.
Nowhere to go because many lack the official documentation, such as a passport, necessary to reclaim their lives. Meanwhile, aid groups like Noshlezhka found their traditional work, like offering meals and beds, further hampered by pandemic conditions and lockdown rules.
At one point, we even started covering the salary of a restaurant chef who had previously prepared food donated from his cafe. And so we kept him on the job so he could prepare food for our care recipients while his restaurant was closed to customers.
Andre, who says he was cheated out of his salary after moving to St. Petersburg for work, a common story that complicates the stigma of Russian homelessness as primarily a cause of drug or alcohol abuse.
It's not right. You work so hard pouring the cement and then they don't pay you. It was only later that I fell into alcohol out of despair.
Andre and others say the economic downturn during the pandemic has left them with few alternatives to scrape out a living and fearing life on the street more than the virus.
I looked at vacancies at the employment agency and there's almost nothing. You look at those newspapers advertising jobs and there's only one.
These are stories of hard times with few easy solutions, but also of communities coming together. Despite growing government suspicion of Russia's NGOs, Noshlezhka's ranks of volunteers and donations have swelled during the pandemic.
Never in our 30 years of work have so many people given thought to and cared for homeless people as they did in 2020. In difficult moments, people naturally think about those who are worse off than themselves.
Now the organization is working to get the city's homeless vaccinated from COVID-19, opening the door to temporary shelter and the wider net of legal, psychological, and employment services Noshlezhka provides. But it's an achingly slow process. Traditional Russian red tape means many will wait years to get the official government documentation that allows them to not only get the shot, but also puts them on the path towards finding something like home. Charles Maines for VOA News, St. Petersburg, Russia.
And far from news on the coronavirus, Chad's military has declared victory over rebels following weeks of conflict in which President Idriss Deby was killed. But the Front for Change and Concord in Chad said it was not aware of an end to the fighting. Neka Chile has more.
Chad soldiers were greeted with cheers as they returned to the capital in N'Djamena on Sunday. The military says it had defeated northern rebels following weeks of fighting. It was in those clashes that President Idris Deby was killed, after which a military council assumed power. On Sunday, the military displayed prisoners and vehicles from the Front for Change and Concord in charge for the media. Abaka Abdul Karim Dawood is the Chadian Army's Chief of General Staff.
We brought back war prisoners and their gear. We cleaned up all the areas where they infiltrated, and I can guarantee that the whole territory is secured. We ask the people to return to their normal occupations and enjoy regained peace. Our country is secured, thanks to God.
However, this is not the first time that the transitional military authorities have declared victory, only for fighting to then continue. The rebel group, which crossed the border with Libya in April, says it was not aware of an end to fighting. A spokesman said they would comment when there was reliable and credible information. Deby's death in a battle against rebels plunged Chad into crisis. The military council led by Deby's son took power and promised an 18-month transition to elections. But opposition politicians and civil society groups have denounced the takeover as a coup. On Saturday, security forces fired tear gas to disperse the protests against the military takeover.
Meanwhile, the European Union has suspended efforts to ratify the trade deal with Beijing as tensions rise over accusations of gross human rights violations in China, as Henry Ridgwell reports from London.
The EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment took 7 years of negotiations and was finally agreed in principle in December. Europe said it was the most ambitious trade deal that China had ever signed. But it's yet to be approved by lawmakers in the European Parliament. The Vice President of the EU Commission said last week that efforts to get it ratified have now been suspended. It follows tit-for-tat sanctions imposed over China's treatment of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang province, which the United States has described as genocide. Washington imposed sanctions on several Beijing officials in March, and the European Union followed with its own measures targeting 4 Chinese officials. China retaliated by sanctioning 5 lawmakers in the European Parliament.
At the end of the day, the ratification happens at the European Parliament. So, in a way, the target was somehow of the sanctions too involved in the decision to ratify.
Analysts say tensions between China and Europe over Xinjiang and the crackdown on the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong mean ratification of the trade deal looks unlikely anytime soon. Germany's leader said the deal should not be abandoned.
Despite all the difficulties that we will certainly encounter in ratification, it is nevertheless a very important initiative that opens up greater reciprocity in access to our reciprocal markets.
The agreement was meant to open China's huge market to European companies. But from the beginning, some European lawmakers saw the deal as deeply flawed.
Every single piece of market access that Europe was getting, when you read the details, is actually not as big.
The investment deal is a key part of China's expansion plans.
Europe is kind of the one and only big developed economic area that where China can still buy companies.
Beijing is pushing Europe to ratify the agreement.
China is willing to communicate and cooperate with EU to promote the realization of the deal as early as possible to benefit people from both sides.
Meanwhile, the EU this week unveiled plans to block foreign companies that are supported by state subsidies from buying European businesses or bidding for public contracts. Analysts say that would impact Chinese state-backed companies looking to expand in Europe. Henry Ridgwell for VOA News, London.
Now, U.S. President Joe Biden meets with lawmakers this week to find common ground on his economic recovery plans, which include spending on infrastructure, childcare and education. The talks come as the United States reported weaker than expected recovery in hiring, as Michelle Quinn reports.
With the latest U.S. employment numbers showing that the economy has a long way to go to recover from the coronavirus pandemic, President Biden is consulting with lawmakers this week to press for the passage of more than $4 trillion of spending in two areas, infrastructure and families. The U.S. Department of Labor says the jobless rate rose to 6.1% in April, up slightly from 6%. U.S. employers added 266,000 jobs in April, according to labor officials, far fewer than the 1 million expected by analysts. Biden defended his administration's efforts and the large economic recovery package that passed in March, without Republican support.
What I'm talking about tonight is the impact on the virus and how it was designed to help us over the course of a year, not 60 days, a year. We never thought that after the first 50 or 60 days, everything would be fine. Today, there's more evidence.
As for why the jobs recovery in the U.S. has been slow, there's a lot of disagreement. Some experts point to hurdles for people going back to work, such as limited access to child care and schools not being fully open. That has hit women in particular. Some Republicans argue that expanded unemployment payments are too generous and a disincentive for people to go back to work.
Paying unemployment benefits that are more than a person makes working doesn't create an environment that's particularly conducive to going back to work.
But some progressive groups say the problem is that wages are too low for many jobs.
Wages are so low at this point, we need to talk about the fact that people will return to work if you have a working class wage, if you have a living wage for people. And so the idea...
U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said last week that she believes the U.S. will reach full employment next year and that the numbers show we're not yet finished. Biden says the weak job growth makes it more urgent for the passage of his spending plans on infrastructure as well as on families, such as expanding the child tax credit. Both plans call for tax increases on wealthy Americans and corporations, which many Republicans oppose. Michelle Quinn, VOA News.
International news so serious this morning. Well, I'll finish off with a funny one. Apparently in Holland, bees have been trained to detect the coronavirus. Jesse?
Let's leave it at that. I cannot add any more to that. But anyway, many thanks for watching. On behalf of the Morning Show team, we say thank you so much. Keep it KTN News for more updates as the day goes by. My name is Jesse Rogers.
And I'm Trixie Ngado. Have a lovely day ahead.
This is KTN News.
We've had accolades being showered on women in tech and women in science. So what about women in art? More women, and especially Muslim women, are now entering that creative space that was once dominated by men.
We don't have like an art background, so it's something I've grown up with. It's like a passion for art, but I did not know I had a passion for mandalas till like in 2015. All these years I know I just love art. It's just basic art.
Mariam is a freelance artist. She recently got her breakthrough when she exhibited her first artwork at Makinon Market in Mombasa. Through an art consultant, Mariam, who uses only one tiny brush, pencils and felt pens for her mandalas, was forced to familiarize herself with spray guns.
Before I worked on Marikiti Rehab, she told me to work with the Mombasa street artist, the one who did the job on Buxton walls. So I had a chance to work because I've never tried doing art with like spray paints and spray guns. So it was new to me. So before I started Marikiti, you know, she told me like, Mariam, just give it a start with this artist. So I worked my first mural art in Kengeleni with the guys. You know, they showed me how to use the stuff and all, how to, you know, get used to that environment.
The mother of one has a unique way of expressing herself. She uses Mandala Art, a geometric configuration of spiritual symbols in Hinduism and Buddhism, representing the universe. The circular designs symbolize the idea that life is never ending and everything is connected. She says that she fell in love with the design when she traveled to China and got exposed to the culture there.
So there was a trip to visit these monks, and they used to do this mandalas, but then in sand form, colored sand form. So I was like intrigued by this type of art. Came back home, I was interested, started. But then back then, the Buddhists and the Hindus used to use this form of art, you know, to represent spirituality. You know, it's used in the religious part, but I didn't want to dwell much on, you know, religion and all that. So I just wanted to do like a twist in it. So with mandalas, I started looking for like the other designs, and I found Islamic art. So with Islamic art and, you know, the patterns, the basic pattern of the mandala, I combine the two and I just get something different, something unique that has no, you know, deeper meaning in it.
Many artists use their extraordinary craft to express themselves, while others use it to take care of their mental health. Research has shown that art can help people with depression, anxiety, and also improve memory and reasoning.
Most of the youth, actually, we suffer from depression, especially after high school. You don't know what to do, because that was like a problem I used to face before I joined university. It was like you're depressed, you don't know what to do with your life. Art, you know, it's not a big thing, but then I just had to pursue it anyways. And in the long run, you know, you think you're not going anywhere. It's helping me, by the way, to like, it's like a form of art therapy. And the same time as you go, you get recognized once you have that like oomph with you, you know, keep on pushing. There will be a way out.
Mariam likes to paint at night when everyone is asleep. We cross borders into neighboring Tanzania, where self-proclaimed wildlife artist Samina Sachak, who lives in Tanga, works with different types of art expressed on flat surfaces. Samina is more advanced in her craft. In 2015, when Samina traveled to India, a neighbor took her artwork to a prestigious art gallery in Mumbai.
So the Jahangir Art Gallery, it's very, very prestigious, and it is very hard to get into. That gallery takes around 7 to 10 years to get into that gallery, but I got it for in 2 years' time. So there are some friends, you know, that they said that please take Jahangir seriously. So I said, what do I paint? I was very good at wildlife, and I said, okay, why not? Let me paint wildlife. It will represent my country and the love for the wildlife from me. And I said, why not? So that is how my journey started.
The self-taught artist who does it full-time now sells her art, but in the beginning she used to do it as a hobby. However, just like Mariam in Kenya, art supplies are scarce in Africa, and the pandemic has made this even more difficult for artists who travel for exhibitions.
Through Instagram, I got to meet the governor of Mombasa, Mr. Hassan Ali Joho, and I'm honored to meet him, and he bought a few paintings from me.
Like Mariam, Samina also likes to paint at night. But unlike Mariam, Samina uses a number of different brushes and her fingers for her creative technique.
Painting nature, it's so beautiful that it is taking me closer and closer to our Creator. I can say Allah, because I just, you know, it just takes me so far, and I just wonder how He has created each hair of the animal, or each dot of the animal, or each piece of grass. And when I'm mixing colors, it's like I have to mix hundreds of colors to bring it to that color, and he has painted the world so beautifully.
The pandemic has not spared the creative industry. It has weakened the social and economic status of artists and cultural professionals across the globe. It has become more of a struggle as they try to find innovative ways of staying afloat.
It needs a lot of
patience.
Yeah, patience.
Sometimes you just give up.
BBC Money Daily is back. Your bite-sized snapshot of what's hot in business and beyond. While the African economy has been down, it definitely hasn't been out and is slowly getting back on its feet. We are here to give you the very latest, showing you how businesses across the continent have managed to keep the wheels of commerce turning, even in crisis. We will feature the continent's brightest experts to help you and your business go from surviving to thriving. Join us every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. See you then.